Malcolm Voss didn't even look up from his whiskey when he signed the paper. He just slid it across the table to his son with 2 fingers, the way a man discards something he's already decided has no value. "She's done," he said. "Get her out of the house by Friday." His son Thomas stared at the document. A physician's letter. Medical language dressed up to sound like fact. 3 doctors. All of them men who owed Malcolm Voss something. A debt, a favor, a secret kept quiet. "She can't give you children," Malcolm said, finally looking up. "A barren woman in this family is a liability, not a wife." Thomas didn't argue. He never argued with his father. That was the day Evelyn Mercer's life ended. Not with cruelty she could fight, but with paperwork she never got to read. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss what happens next. Stories like this one, where the people everyone counted out end up surprising every single person in the room. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Evelyn, because it's about to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. The notice came on a Tuesday. Not a conversation, not even a knock at the door with the decency of eye contact. Just an envelope left on the kitchen table while Evelyn was out hanging laundry, the morning air still cool enough that her breath made small clouds in front of her face. She came back inside with the basket balanced against her hip and saw it there. Cream-colored paper, her name written in Thomas's careful, small handwriting on the front. She set the basket down slowly. She already knew. The way you know sometimes, before the news arrives, because the house feels different, quieter, like something has already left. She opened it anyway. It took her 3 readings to understand what she was looking at. The language was formal, clotted with medical terminology she'd heard fragments of over the past year, words spoken in low tones between Thomas and his father in rooms she wasn't supposed to enter, conversations that stopped when she appeared in doorways. Uterine insufficiency, congenital defect, prognosis, permanent. At the bottom, a sentence she did understand. As such, the continuation of this marriage is not in the best interest of the Voss family line, not Thomas's line, Malcolm's line. She sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't cry. She'd used up most of her crying over the past 8 months, lying awake at night wondering what was wrong with her body, why it wouldn't do the one thing everyone expected it to do, why Thomas had started sleeping in the guest room without explanation, why Malcolm had stopped looking at her at Sunday dinners. She'd grieved privately, quietly, the way women in Red Hollow were expected to grieve everything, without making it anyone else's problem. Now she sat with the letter in her hands and felt something she hadn't expected. Anger. Not the hot, sharp kind that made you say things you regretted. Something colder. Something that settled into her chest like creek ice in January and didn't show on her face at all. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her apron pocket. Then she went back outside and finished hanging the laundry because the sheet still needed to dry, and collapsing on the kitchen floor wouldn't change anything. Thomas came home at 4 in the afternoon. He stood in the doorway to the sitting room where she was mending a hem, and he had the particular posture of a man who wants credit for doing something he knows is wrong. "You got the letter," he said. "I got it." "Evelyn, you could have told me yourself." He shifted his weight. "My father thought it was better to—" "I'm not asking what your father thought." Silence stretched between them. Thomas was a decent-looking man, not unkind in the way some men were unkind, not given to cruelty for its own sake. He just wasn't strong enough for anything that required him to choose between his father and anyone else. Evelyn had known this for years and had told herself it didn't matter. She'd been wrong. The doctors said, "3 doctors your father hired," she said. Her voice was flat. "3 men who've had dinner at your father's table." Thomas's jaw tightened. "They're qualified physicians." "Did you read the reports yourself?" He didn't answer. "Did you ask for a second opinion from someone your father doesn't know?" Still nothing. "Thomas." She set down her mending and looked at him directly. "Did any part of you wonder whether this was true?" What crossed his face then wasn't guilt exactly. It was something smaller and worse. Relief. He was relieved she was asking the question so he didn't have to. Relieved that she was making it possible for him to stand there and do nothing, because she was doing the hard thing for him. That was the moment she understood clearly. It didn't matter whether the medical reports were true or fabricated. Either way, Thomas had chosen his answer before he'd ever read the letter. "I'll be out by Friday," she said. She picked up her mending again. "You can tell your father his timing is fine." Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, and left the room. She finished the hem. Her hands didn't shake at all. She had nowhere to go. That was the part no one thought about when they imagined a woman walking away from a bad marriage. There was always the assumption that somewhere there was a door she could knock on. A sister, a mother, a childhood friend with a spare room and no questions. Evelyn had none of that. Her parents had died within a year of each other when she was 19. Her mother from fever, her father from the particular kind of grief that doesn't leave once it moves in. She had one aunt in Colorado who'd never forgiven her for marrying below what she considered acceptable, and two distant cousins she'd met twice at funerals. She rented a room above the dry goods store from a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who had the decency not to ask too many questions in the first week. The room was small, with a sloped ceiling that Evelyn kept forgetting about, and a window that looked onto the alley where deliveries happened every morning at 6. She had her clothes, 2 books, her mother's quilt, and about $40 in savings that Thomas had apparently forgotten about, because his father's lawyer hadn't thought to ask about the small account she'd opened in her own name 2 years ago, quietly, because she'd always had the instinct to keep something for herself. She found work quickly enough, bookkeeping for the feed store, and 2 afternoons a week helping the school teacher with correspondence. It wasn't comfortable, but it was something. The real problem wasn't money, it was Red Hollow, a town of 400 people with 3 churches, 2 saloons, and a memory like a steel trap. Everyone knew within a week. Everyone had already formed their opinion, as people do when a story falls in their lap, fully formed, without the complication of actual knowledge. The facts as Red Hollow understood them. Evelyn Mercer could not have children. The Voss family had done the right thing by their son. It was a hard situation, but what could you do? She heard whispers in the Mercantile. She saw women change direction when they noticed her coming up the street. She sat through Sunday service with her back straight and her face composed, and felt the distance that opened up around her like water moving away from a stone. None of it was violent, none of it was even loud. It was the quiet kind of cruelty, the kind that doesn't leave marks. The worst of it came from Malcolm Voss himself. He was at the Founders' Day gathering, 3 weeks after the letter. A long table under the elm trees, food spread out, children running in the grass, the whole pleasant performance of community. Evelyn had almost stayed home. Mrs. Calloway had convinced her that staying home only made it worse, gave people more to talk about, let the story grow without her there to be a living contradiction to it. So she went. She was standing near the lemonade table when she heard his voice carrying across the lawn, pitched just loud enough for the people around him to hear. "Shame, really," Malcolm was saying. He was talking to Hector Price, the land broker, and 2 other men whose names Evelyn knew, but whose regard she'd never needed. Thomas did everything a man was supposed to do, treated that woman well. And nature just, well. He paused, sighed, the sigh of a deeply compassionate man. Some women aren't built for it, nothing anyone could have done. The men around him made sounds of agreement. One of them shook his head. Evelyn set down her lemonade glass before she dropped it. She walked across the lawn and stopped 6 feet from Malcolm Voss and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Voss." He turned. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprised, because Malcolm Voss was rarely surprised, but a quick recalculation, the way a man who's used to controlling a situation resets when a variable moves on its own. "Evelyn," he nodded once. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I live here." "Of course." Another nod, odd, patient, paternalistic. "You're looking well." "I heard what you said." Silence. "About Thomas," she continued, "about how he did everything right. I think we have different definitions of what that means." Malcolm's expression didn't change. That was the thing about men like him. They'd been polishing their composure for decades. He simply looked at her with mild, benevolent regret, the kind of look you give a child who says something embarrassing without understanding why. "My dear," he said, "this isn't the place." "You're right," she said. "It isn't. But you chose it, not me." She held his gaze for 5 seconds. Then she walked away. Back straight, chin level, hands loose at her sides. She shook for about 20 minutes after, sitting behind the Calloway's barn where no one could see her, pressing her palms flat against her thighs and breathing through her mouth. But she'd done it. She'd looked at him directly and spoken plainly, and walked away without crying or shouting or giving him a single thing he could use. Small victories. She was collecting them, even when they cost her. The proposal came 6 weeks later, and it came from the worst possible source. She was in the feed store, going through the week's receipts, when Hector Price appeared in the doorway. He was a short, well-fed man who always dressed one level above what the occasion required, as if he was perpetually about to meet someone more important than whoever he was currently talking to. "Miss Mercer," he said. He still called her Miss, not Mrs. She noticed these things now. "Mr. Price." She didn't look up from the ledger. He came in anyway, the way men like him always did. Not rudeness exactly, but a complete absence of waiting to be invited. He pulled up the stool across from her and settled his hat on his knee. "I'll come straight to the point," he said. "There's a situation that might work out well for both parties, if you're amenable." She looked up. "Silas Boone," he said. "You know the name?" She'd heard it. Everyone in Red Hollow had heard it, the way you hear about weather in a distant county. Something out there, real enough, but operating in its own separate world. Silas Boone was a man who lived up in the mountain range on the far side of the valley. He'd had the land for years, ran cattle, did some horse work, came into town maybe 4 or 5 times a year for supplies and nothing else. He was known for 2 things: an unusual skill with difficult horses, and a thorough lack of interest in anyone's opinion of him. Some people called him strange. Some called him antisocial. Some of the older ranchers called him the best judge of land and livestock in the territory, but they said it quietly, the way you acknowledge something that disrupts your preferred narrative. "I know the name," Evelyn said carefully. "He needs a wife," Price said. "Practically speaking, men can't run a full ranch without someone to manage the domestic side, and he's at a point where the ranch could be something real, but he needs—" He waved his hand. "You know, a partner. Someone to handle the household, the books, that kind of thing." Evelyn set down her pen. "And you thought of me." "You're available," Price said. Then hearing himself, "That came out plain. I mean to say, you're capable. You can manage accounts, you're not afraid of hard work, and you're—" "Damaged goods," she said. Her voice was calm. "That's the word I think you're looking for. You're suggesting a match between 2 people nobody else wants." Price had the decency to look uncomfortable. "That's not— Does he know about me?" "He knows you're available for marriage." "Does he know why?" Price adjusted his hat on his knee. "The medical situation has come up." Evelyn understood then. This wasn't about finding Silas Boone a suitable wife. This was a joke, or near enough to one. The barren bride and the mountain recluse, matched by men who thought it was amusing. She could see the dinner conversation afterward, Malcolm Voss raising a glass to the cleverness of it. She should have said no. She knew, sitting there in the feed store with the September dust coming through the open door, that the reasonable thing was to say no. "Has he agreed to meet me?" she asked instead. Price blinked. "Well, yes. He said if you were willing." He had no objection. "No objection," she repeated. His words. She thought about her room above the dry goods store, the sloped ceiling, the 6 o'clock deliveries. She thought about Malcolm Voss at the Founders' Day gathering, explaining her deficiency to men who nodded along. She thought about Thomas's face when she'd asked whether he'd wondered if the reports were true. "Tell him I'll come," she said. "Once. To see the land and talk. That's all." Price nodded quickly, already standing, already moving toward the door, with the energy of a man who's completed a task he's been assigned. "Mr. Price." She picked up her pen again. "If this is entertainment for certain people in this town, I want you to know I'm aware of that." He paused. "I'm going because I choose to," she said. "Not because anyone handed me off." He left without answering. She finished the receipts. Her handwriting was perfectly steady. The road up to Boone Ridge took 3 hours by wagon, and it was not a forgiving 3 hours. The track climbed out of the valley floor through scrub oak and yellow pine, crossing 2 creek beds that had no bridges, winding up along ridge lines where the wind came in sideways, and the wheels found every loose stone simultaneously. Evelyn drove herself. She'd borrowed Mrs. Calloway's old wagon and one of the feed store's dependable horses, a gray mare named Sugar, who had the sense to pick her own footing on difficult ground. Evelyn hadn't told anyone where she was going except Mrs. Calloway, who had responded with a long pause and then, "Well, I suppose it's your decision to make." The land changed as she climbed. The valley ranches below were flat and methodical, fenced and parceled into straight lines that reflected the ambitions of men who wanted to impose order on geography. Up here, the land did what it wanted. The meadows appeared without warning between stands of timber. The creek jumped its banks where it felt like it and carved new channels through the rock. A person could feel the valley dropping away behind them, and with it, a certain set of assumptions about how things were supposed to look. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Terrified, mostly. But something else underneath. She smelled the ranch before she saw it, wood smoke and horses, and the particular green smell of water nearby. Then the trees opened up, and there it was. It wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected ramshackle, a bachelor's neglect, leaning fences, and a cabin that was one hard winter from giving up. That was the story she'd been told, implicitly. A man who couldn't manage, who'd isolated himself because civilization had run out of patience for him. What she found was different. The main cabin was solid, rough-hewn logs, certainly, nothing pretty about it, but built with the kind of attention to plumb and level that took patience. The fence lines she could see from the track were mended. The horses in the far pasture were good horses, not a collection of worn-out stock, but animals that moved with quality. A garden plot sat off the east side of the cabin, late season and past its peak now, but clearly someone's real work, not an afterthought. She reined Sugar in at the edge of the yard. A man came around the side of the cabin. He was carrying a bucket and a coil of rope, and he stopped when he saw her. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the particular way of men who work outdoors in all weather, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been weathered into an expression she couldn't easily read. He set the bucket down. "Miss Mercer," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Boone." He looked at her the way she'd seen him described, direct, unhurried, not hostile, but not accommodating either. A man who'd decided some time ago that he wasn't going to pretend to be easier than he was. "You made it up the road," he said. "I did." "That creek crossing on the South Fork give you trouble?" Sugar handled it. He glanced at the gray mare with something like approval. "Good horse." "She belongs to Mrs. Calloway." He nodded once, picked up the bucket again. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's on." It was not an invitation full of warmth. It was not particularly romantic. It was the offer of a practical man who had agreed to a meeting and was going to follow through on that agreement without pretense. She climbed down from the wagon and tied Sugar to the post and followed him inside. The cabin was one large room divided by habit rather than walls. Cooking area on one side table and 2 chairs in the middle, a wood stove that was working hard, a sleeping area curtained off in the back corner. It was clean. Not the scrubbed clean of a man trying to impress someone, but the functional clean of a person who'd decided mess was inefficient. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set them on the table and sat down across from her. She waited. He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to say what I think, and you can decide if you want to hear more after." "All right." "This situation?" He stopped, started again. "I know what people in town are saying about it. I know what Price was sent up here to arrange. I'm not unaware that this has been organized in a particular spirit." She wrapped her hands around the tin cup. "What spirit is that?" "The kind where 2 people who've been decided against get matched up for the amusement of people who think they're better." He said it plainly, without heat. "I don't think you're unaware of that either." "I'm not." "So." He looked at her directly. "I want to say first, I didn't agree to this because I think you've got nowhere else to go. And I didn't agree because Price told me you can't have children, and I figure that makes us a tidy match of broken things." His voice didn't change inflection on that last part. It was just words, facts he was organizing aloud. "I agreed because I need help with this ranch, and I need someone who can manage accounts and think clearly. And Price told me you can do both. That's the beginning and end of my reasoning." Evelyn looked at him. "You believe the doctors," she said. He met her eyes. "I don't know what to believe about someone else's body. That's not my business to have an opinion on." It took her a moment to understand what he'd said, the particular meaning of it. Not I believe you're barren, and not I think the doctors were wrong, but something more careful than either. A refusal to make a judgment on something he'd decided he didn't have standing to judge. She'd never heard a man say anything like it. "This is a hard ranch," he said. "I want you to know that going in. The winters up here are serious. The work doesn't stop for weather. Wolves took 3 cattle last winter. The South Creek needs rerouting before next spring or it's going to undercut the east pasture. I'm not in debt, but I'm not comfortable either." He drank his coffee. "I think it could be something. I think with the right work and a couple of good years, this place could be solid. But I won't pretend it's already there." "What would you want from me?" He thought about that. Not the quick answer of a man who'd rehearsed this. Actually thought. "Someone to manage the books in the household," he said. "Someone to make decisions when I'm not here. Someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong without spending 3 days working up to it." A pause. "And someone who'll be treated like a person with sense and a right to their own thinking. I can offer that much." Evelyn looked around the cabin, at the solid walls, the honest fire, the 2 cups on the table. "What I want," she said slowly, "is to not be in that town anymore. I want work that means something, and I want to be taken seriously at it. I want to not have to watch my back every time I walk down a street." She looked back at him. "And I want to be honest with you, which means I'll tell you that I don't know if this can work. I don't know you, you don't know me. We could sit here all afternoon and still not know enough." "That's true," he said, "but I'm willing to try." He looked at her for a long moment. "If you're willing to stay," he said, "this ranch is yours too. Not welcome to my home. Not I'll take care of you. This ranch is yours too. Equal weight, equal stake." She thought about Malcolm Voss's face at the Founders' Day gathering, the 2-fingered way he'd slid that letter across the table to his son. The relief on Thomas's face when she'd made the exit easy for him. "When would you want me to come?" she asked. "When you're ready." "End of the week." He nodded, stood, picked up his coffee cup. "I'll have the south room cleared out," he said. She finished her coffee, stood, pulled on her coat. At the door she stopped. "Mr. Boone, you said you know why this was arranged, the way people are seeing it." "I know." "Doesn't it bother you, being made the end of someone's joke?" He picked up his rope and bucket from beside the door, looked at her with that same unreadable directness. "People have been deciding what I am since I was old enough for it to matter," he said. "I stopped letting that navigate my decisions about 10 years ago." He opened the door. Outside, Sugar shifted her weight and the harness jingled. "The question I ask is whether a thing makes sense for my life, not whether someone somewhere thinks it's funny." She stepped out into the cold, clean air. "End of the week," she said. "I'll be here," he said. She untied Sugar and climbed back into the wagon and turned her back down the mountain road. And it wasn't until she was through the first tree line and out of sight of the cabin that she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just agreed to. She was going up that mountain. She was leaving Red Hollow and all its careful cruelty and its arranged story about what she was worth and who she was allowed to become. And she was doing it on her own terms, in her own wagon, with her own $40 and her own pair of working hands. Let them laugh. She'd been the ending of their joke. She intended, eventually, to become something they hadn't written into the story at all. Sugar picked her way down the creek crossing without hesitation, and the cold water sprayed bright in the afternoon light, and somewhere far below, the valley went on being the valley. Sure of itself, arranged just so, full of people who thought they already knew how this ended. They didn't. She moved in on a Friday, which felt like either bad luck or a deliberate irony she'd chosen not to examine too closely. Mrs. Calloway helped her load the wagon without comment, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in weeks. The older woman tucked a jar of preserved peaches between the folded quilt and a stack of account ledgers, and said only, "You write when you get settled," and squeezed Evelyn's hand once, hard, and went back inside before either of them could make it into something more than it was. Evelyn drove up the mountain in the early morning before Red Hollow had fully woken, which was also deliberate. She didn't need an audience for this part. Silas was in the yard when she arrived, splitting wood near the barn. He stopped when he heard the wagon, set the axe against the chopping block, and came over to help carry things inside without being asked and without making a ceremony of it. That was the first thing she noticed about him in the days that followed. He had a complete absence of performance. He didn't narrate his helpfulness or expect recognition for ordinary decency. He just did things and moved on to the next thing. It was stranger than she'd expected living alongside that quality in a person. She'd spent 6 years married to a man who required constant acknowledgement of his own goodness. The south room had been cleared, as promised. A bed frame, a small dresser, a hook behind the door for her coat, clean, functional, her own. She unpacked her 2 books and her mother's quilt and set the preserved peaches on the windowsill and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening to the wind come through the pine trees outside and the distant sound of Silas returning to his wood splitting. "All right," she said to herself quietly, to no one. Then she got up and went to find the state of the kitchen. The state of the kitchen was a project. Not disastrous, Silas clearly ate and had the means to feed himself, but organized according to a logic that only made sense to one person, which is to say, it wasn't really organized at all. Supplies were stored without system. The account book she found shoved behind a coffee tin was a disaster of incomplete entries and transposed numbers that made her close her eyes briefly and breathe. She started with the accounts. "This column," she said that evening, spreading the ledger on the table between them after supper, "doesn't match anything on this side. You've been subtracting your feed costs from the wrong total for how long?" Silas looked at the page. "Since I started keeping it." "That's... You thought you were breaking even on the cattle." "I thought I was." "You weren't. You were actually..." She ran the column again, quickly, in her head. "About $60 a head." He was quiet for a moment. "That changes some things," he said. "Yes." She turned the page. "I'm going to need to redo this from the beginning of last year. Is that all right?" "Take what you need." She worked until the lamp oil ran low, and when she finally looked up, Silas was gone. She hadn't heard him go, just became aware that the chair across from her was empty and the cabin was quiet except for the stove. She hadn't had that in years. The ability to work until she was finished without someone requiring her attention before she was done. She banked the stove and went to bed and slept harder than she had in months. The first real test came in the second week. She was in the garden, assessing what was left of the late-season growth, calculating what would need replanting in spring, when she heard hooves coming up the track. 2 horses. She straightened and looked, and her stomach tightened before she'd even consciously registered what she was seeing. It was Hector Price, with a man she didn't know riding alongside him. Price wore his usual expression of self-important pleasantness. The other man was older, heavier, with the kind of face that had spent decades arranging itself into authority. Silas came out of the barn. "Boone," Price called, pulling up his horse. "Just a friendly visit. Wanted to see how the arrangement was settling in." The way he said arrangement had a particular texture, not quite mocking, but pointed enough that it could cut if you held it wrong. "Price," Silas said. He didn't move toward them. Didn't offer his hand. "What do you need?" "Just checking in." Price's eyes moved to Evelyn, still holding her garden trowel. "Miss Mercer, how are you finding mountain life?" "It's fine," she said. "Adjusting well, I hope." He was doing the thing where a person says something neutral and implies something else entirely. She'd had years of practice identifying it. "It's quite a change from town." "I manage," she said. The man beside Price spoke then. "Boone, I'm Dale Cutter. I represent the Ridgeline Cattle Association. We've been approached about whether Boone Ridge might be interested in a consolidation arrangement." He made it sound reasonable. He'd clearly made it sound reasonable many times. "Several of the smaller mountain operations are joining. Better prices on feed, shared grazing rights, collective bargaining on contracts." Silas looked at him steadily. "Who's running the association?" "The operational committee is..." "Who funds it?" A small pause. "Several principal investors from the valley, Malcolm Voss among them." Another pause. Cutter's expression rearranged itself slightly. "Mr. Voss is one of several..." "No," Silas said. Cutter blinked. "I haven't finished explaining the terms." "I don't need to hear the terms. The answer is no." Price cleared his throat. "Boone, that's a hasty..." "I gave you my answer." Silas looked at them both without hostility and without any particular inclination to soften the word. "You made the ride up here for nothing. I'm sorry about that, but the answer's no." Cutter's gaze moved to Evelyn. She recognized the calculation in it, assessing whether she was an angle he could work. whether the woman might have different influence over the man. "Mrs. Boone," he said, using the name deliberately, "surely you can see the practical benefits." "It's still no," Evelyn said. She set her trowel against the garden fence. "And for future reference, asking me to override my husband's answer isn't a strategy that's going to work here." The men exchanged a look. "Well," Price gathered his reins. "The offer stands. Association's taking members through the end of October." He looked at Silas with something that was trying to be friendly and not quite getting there. "Just think it over." They rode back down the track. Evelyn and Silas stood in the yard and watched them go. "Malcolm Voss," she said when they were out of earshot. "He's been trying to get control of the mountain water rights for 3 years," Silas said. "Anyone who joins that association signs over partial control of their creek access. He gets the water, he controls who runs cattle up here." Evelyn stared down the empty track. "And he thought sending Price. He thought Price could talk me into it. Or that you—" He stopped. "That I'd be grateful enough for the marriage to be manageable," she said. "Easier to work with." Something like that. She thought about the calculation she'd seen in Cutter's face when he'd redirected toward her. She thought about Malcolm Voss in his Valley office, deciding she was still a piece to move on his board. "He underestimates how much I dislike him," she said. Something crossed Silas's face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "I noticed that about you," he said. He went back toward the barn. October came in cold and immediately difficult. The wolf problem that Silas had mentioned in their first conversation proved to be not a problem, but a situation. An ongoing negotiation between the ranch and a pack that had established itself in the timber to the north, smart enough to avoid the traps Silas had set, bold enough to take livestock when the opportunity arose. They lost a calf in the first week of October, found it at the tree line with the tracks telling the whole story. Silas was grim about it, in the particular way of men who've lost something they'd worked for. He didn't rage, didn't blame anything, just looked at the tracks and said, 3 of them, same ones that took the Henderson calf in September. Same pack? Same lead animal. See this front right print, wider spread than the others. Distinctive." She crouched beside him and looked at the tracks in the frost. She hadn't spent much time looking at animal tracks before, but the difference was visible once he'd pointed it out. "What do we do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, thinking in the way she'd come to recognize, to not performing consideration but actually doing it, actually working through variables. "Move the calves closer to the barn at night," he said. "Increase the lamp rotation, and I'm going to talk to the Henderson brothers about coordinating. If the pack is ranging between our operations, we need to be working together on this." "What do the Hendersons think of—" She wasn't sure how to finish that. "Of you?" He stood. "Bill Henderson doesn't care about town gossip. His brother Roy does, but Roy follows Bill." He picked up the lantern. "They'll be fine." The Henderson brothers came over 2 days later and were, as predicted, fine. Bill immediately practical and focused on the wolf problem, Roy clearly having received an instruction from his brother about what behavior was acceptable. Evelyn made coffee and contributed 2 observations about the timing of the attacks that neither brother had considered, and by the end of the conversation they were addressing her directly without apparent discomfort. Small victories, still collecting them. The drought was a different kind of problem. The summer had been dry, and the creek Silas depended on for the pasture irrigation was running low by mid-October, lower than it should have been for the season, lower than Silas said he'd seen it in 7 years. "It's being diverted," he said one morning, standing at the creek bank and looking upstream with the expression of a man confirming something he'd suspected. Upstream, above the ridge. "Can someone do that legally?" "If they have the water rights, yes. If they don't, no." He picked up a stick and turned it in the water, watching the current. "I've got prior appropriation on this creek. I filed the claim when I bought this land. But someone upstream has been diverting, and I don't know yet who or how much." "Have you filed a complaint?" "With who? The county water board is—" He set down the stick. "It's Malcolm Voss's brother-in-law." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Of course it is," she said. They stood at the creek bank in the cold morning, and she understood then that what she'd walked into wasn't just a difficult ranch in a hard country. She'd walked into a territory that one man was trying to consolidate quietly, piece by piece, using whatever mechanism was available, legal, social, familial. The cattle association, the water board, the arranged marriages and the medical reports and the shaped opinions in the town below. It was all connected. He's been planning this for a long time, she said. Long time. And Boone Ridge is in his way. My water access, specifically. Without this creek through summer, I can't run the cattle numbers I need to be viable. He knows that. Silas looked upstream again. He's been patient about it. That's what makes him dangerous. She thought for a moment. Do you have documentation of your water claim? Original filing? Somewhere. I need to find it. He looked at her. I can read a legal filing, she said. I can tell you whether your claim holds and what it covers. And if someone is diverting water in violation of a prior appropriation claim, there are legal remedies that don't involve the county water board. He was quiet for a long moment. State level, she said. Territorial Water Commission. He studied her. How do you know about the Territorial Commission? My father had a water dispute with a neighboring farm when I was 12, she said. He lost because he didn't know about the commission until it was too late. I watched him lose it, and I read every document afterward trying to understand where he'd gone wrong. She looked back upstream at the diminished creek. I know where he went wrong. That evening, Silas brought out a battered wooden box from under his bed and set it on the table, and they went through it together. Land grants, purchase records, the original water claim filing, correspondence with the county from 3 years back. She read everything carefully, taking notes in her own hand, organizing as she went. At 10 o'clock, she looked up and said, Your claim is solid. Prior appropriation, filed correctly, witnessed and recorded with the territorial office. Whoever is diverting that water upstream is in direct violation. Can I do anything about it? Yes, she said. But you need to document the diversion first. Physical evidence, measurements, dates. Then you file with the Territorial Commission and you go around the county board entirely. That'll make enemies. You already have one, she said. Might as well be thorough. He looked at her with that expression she'd been trying to categorize since the first day. Not quite admiration, not quite surprise. Something that was working its way toward respect by a route that didn't require announcement. All right, he said. How do we start? The we was not lost on her. November arrived with its full cold and its shorter days, and the ranch found a rhythm. She rose before light and managed the morning accounts while the coffee heated. He was already outside by the time she brought a cup to the barn door. She'd started doing this without thinking about it, without it being a thing she'd decided. He would take it with both hands, drink half of it, set it on the fence post, and go back to work. Neither of them commented on this. It was just a thing that happened. She learned the ranch by doing it. The horses first. She was comfortable with horses, had grown up with them, but these were Silas's animals, and they had opinions about being handled by someone new. She spent a week just being present in the pasture, letting them come to her on their terms. He watched this without comment on the first day, and on the second day she caught him watching from the barn with an expression that suggested she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. That bay mare, she said one evening. Mira. She's been favoring her left foreleg. I know. Had the farrier up last month, said it was a stone bruise. It's not a stone bruise. She'd watched the mare move all week, the specific hesitation, the way she distributed weight. It's higher, soft tissue. She needs to be off work for 3 weeks minimum. He looked at her. You sure? My uncle bred horses. I spent 2 summers watching him work with a veterinarian before I was sent away to school. She kept her voice even. I'm not guessing. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. I'll pull her from rotation. He didn't make her prove it further, didn't require a third opinion or a long justification. He just listened and adjusted. It was, again, a thing she hadn't realized she'd been missing until she had it. The bay mare improved in 2 weeks. December brought the first real snowfall, and with it, company neither of them had invited. She was in the cabin working through the year's accounts when she heard a horse on the track and then a knock. Not Silas's knock, which wasn't really a knock at all, just the door opening, but a deliberate visitor's knock. She opened it. A woman stood on the step, 40 or so, bundled in a heavy coat, with a child of about 6 on her hip and another standing behind her leg. She was not anyone Evelyn had seen before. Are you Mrs. Boone? The woman asked. Her voice was careful, a person used to uncertain receptions. I am. My name is Clara Finch. My husband worked for the Henderson operation. He had an accident in October. She stopped. Started again. I don't have anywhere to go for winter. Bill Henderson said to ask you. He said Mr. Boone has a policy about. She stopped again, uncertain. Evelyn looked at her, looked at the two children, looked at the saddlebag Clara was carrying, which appeared to contain everything she owned. Come inside, Evelyn said. Get warm first. Silas came in an hour later to find 3 extra people at his table, and the cabin warmer than it had been in weeks from the extra body heat. He looked at Clara Finch and her children, and then he looked at Evelyn, who was matter-of-factly pouring soup into 4 bowls. I told her we'd figure out the storage room, Evelyn said, without looking up. It's not heated properly, but I can rig something with the extra stovepipe. Silas looked at Clara. Your husband was Tom Finch? Yes, sir. He nodded once, slowly. He was a good man. He hung his coat, sat down. We'll figure out the storage room. Later, after the children were asleep and Clara was in the storage room they'd improvised into something livable, Evelyn and Silas sat at the table and she said, Bill Henderson said you have a policy. Silas looked at his coffee cup. What does that mean exactly? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. My father lost this land twice, he said. Not because he was bad at ranching, because when things got hard, no one helped. He turned the cup in his hands. So I decided that when I had anything to offer, I wouldn't do what was done to him. She thought about that. You've done this before, she said, taken people in. Couple of times. Without asking me. He looked up. That's fair. I should have. No. She stopped him. I'm not objecting. I'm just noting that you did it, and you were right to. And if you'd asked me beforehand, I would have said yes. She looked at him steadily. Just tell me next time so I can have the room ready before they arrive. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing with Silas was dramatic. But something settled, the way things settle when a tension you've been carrying turns out not to be necessary. All right, he said. Good. The snow came down outside and the stove worked hard and the cabin held its warmth, and she sat across from him and thought that she was living inside someone else's joke and had somehow started making it into a life. The sabotage started in January. They didn't recognize it as sabotage at first. That was the cleverness of it, that each individual incident could be attributed to bad luck or ordinary hardship. A fence line down on the east boundary. Could be an elk. A bag of grain ruined in the barn, smelled of something she couldn't identify. She assumed moisture. 2 horses gone one morning from the pasture, the gate somehow open. She and Silas both tried to think of how they might have failed to latch it. But when the well water turned brackish in February, not gradually, not through any natural process, but suddenly and completely, Silas stood at the well for a long time and then said, This didn't happen by itself. Evelyn pulled up a bucket and smelled it, and her stomach went flat. Something was put in it, she said. He looked at the surrounding snow. Carefully, the way he'd looked at the wolf tracks. She watched him reading the ground, and she watched the moment he found what he was looking for. A set of boot prints approaching from the east, from the tree line. Not their boots, not the size or pattern of anyone who lived or worked on this ranch. 3 nights ago, he said, looking at the half-thawed tracks. While we had that 2-day cold snap. You think it was deliberate from the beginning, she said. Not a question. I think the fence and the grain and the horses were watching, he said, seeing how we'd respond. And when we didn't leave and didn't fall apart, they moved to something they thought we couldn't fix. The water was the ranch's weakness in winter, with the creek iced over and the well being the primary source. Without clean water, the livestock would suffer first, and after that, everything else. Then we fix it? I need to pull the casing, he said. Clean it out. Get to it before the next freeze. He looked at the well and then at her. I'm going to need help. Tell me what to do. He told her. It was cold, hard, unglamorous work. The kind of work that left her hands raw and her back aching for 3 days. But by nightfall, the well was clean and recased and covered, and the water was clear. They stood by it in the dark, both of them exhausted, steam rising from their breath. They'll try again, he said. I know. I want to set watches, nighttime rotation. Wake me if you hear anything that isn't wind. All right. He looked at her in the lantern light. She was dirty and cold, and her hands hurt, and she knew she looked like someone who had been pulled through the worst kind of work, which was because she had. You didn't have to come up that mountain, he said. Not sentiment, just fact. Acknowledging something he thought should be acknowledged. No, she said. But I did. He picked up the lantern and they went inside. Clara had kept the stove going and heated soup without being asked, and the children had made a genuine attempt to set the table, which resulted in the utensils being in entirely wrong positions, and Evelyn sat down at the table and ate hot soup in a cold cabin on a ranch that someone was actively trying to destroy, and thought that she was not, at this moment, unhappy. That was strange enough to notice. March arrived and the sabotage escalated. One morning they woke to find the east barn had nearly burned in the night. The smell of smoke reached Evelyn through her sleep like a hand on her shoulder, and she was up before she was fully awake, out the door, and Silas was already there, already working the bucket line from the water trough they'd kept unfrozen exactly for this purpose, because he'd been expecting something. They saved the barn. Barely. The east wall was scorched and 2 of the stored hay bales were destroyed, but the structure held. Afterward, standing in the cold morning with ash on her face and her heart still hammering, she looked at what remained of the scorch pattern on the outer wall and said, "That started from outside, low on the wall. Someone said it." "Yes. We need to catch who's doing this." He was looking at the wall too, jaw set, soot across his hands. "I have an idea about that." "Tell me." He told her. It was a risk, she said. It would require leaving the livestock exposed in a way that would hurt them if it went wrong. It would require them to be awake and in position every night for however long it took, which in deep March meant cold that had teeth. "But if it works," she said slowly, "we get who's doing this." "And we get proof of who sent them," he said, "which is what we actually need." She thought about Malcolm Voss in his Valley office, patient and methodical, working his plan across months and seasons. She thought about Thomas sliding the letter across the table with 2 fingers. "Set the trap," she said. He nodded once. Clara, listening from across the cabin with her children quiet beside her, said, "What do you need me to do?" Silas looked at her. "You want to help?" he asked. "Tom would have," she said. "So yes." Evelyn looked at the 2 of them. This woman who'd arrived at her door with everything she owned in a saddlebag, and this man who'd agreed to a marriage arranged as a joke, and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Something between gratitude and determination, with an edge to it that was something close to love, though not the kind she'd been taught to expect. "Then here's what we do," Silas said. Outside, the March wind moved through the pine trees and the damaged barn stood solid enough, and the ranch went on existing despite everything that had been aimed at it, which was, Evelyn was beginning to understand, the whole point. Not triumph, not vindication, just persistence, past the point where they'd been expected to quit. That, it turned out, was its own kind of answer. The trap took 11 nights to spring. 11 nights of cold that settled into the bones by the second hour and didn't leave until well past dawn. 11 nights of rotating watches. Evelyn taking the first shift from 10 until 2, Silas from 2 until first light, Clara holding the cabin and the children and the signal lantern that sat in the east window, ready to be covered if something moved in the yard. The plan was simple, which was why it had a chance of working. Silas had moved the best horses out of the east barn quietly, over 3 nights, redistributing them to the main barn and the lean-to at the north end of the pasture, leaving only 2 older animals in the east barn, sound horses, not valuable ones, but enough to make the barn look normally occupied from the outside. Then he'd arranged the hay in the damaged east wall in a particular way, stacked to look like a natural repair, but structured so that anyone who approached from the tree line and tried to finish what they'd started with, the fire, would have to come within 15 feet of the hidden position he'd built into the corner of the pasture fence. Evelyn had questioned that detail on the first night. "You're putting yourself in a fence corner," she said. They were standing in the dark at the edge of the tree line, speaking in low voices. "If someone comes, you've got no angle of retreat." "I don't need one," he said. "I need a clear view of whoever comes out of those trees." "And if there's more than one of them?" He was quiet for a moment, which meant he'd already considered this and had decided to proceed anyway. She recognized that particular silence by now. "Then I need to be faster than they expect," he said. She wanted to argue further. She looked at the dark tree line and the barn and the cold empty yard between, and she understood that argument wasn't going to change the mathematics of the situation. What they needed was someone in that corner with a clear line of sight, and Silas was the better option for it. He could hold still in cold weather longer than anyone she'd ever known, could go from stillness to movement without the hesitation she'd noticed in herself. "All right," she said, "but I'm taking the ridge position, not the cabin." "Evelyn, if someone comes out of those trees, you need someone watching the north approach. From the cabin, Clara can't see the north side at all." She kept her voice level, factual, not asking. "Put me on the ridge." He considered that for a long moment. "Take the Winchester," he said. "I know how to shoot." "I know you do. Take it anyway." She took the Winchester. She spent those 11 nights on a flat rock shelf on the low ridge that ran along the north side of the pasture, wrapped in every layer she owned, plus a wool horse blanket that smelled aggressively of horse, watching the tree line and the barn and the small square of Silas's position at the fence corner that she could just barely make out when the moon was up. Clara kept the signal lantern in the east window, and its faint light was the reference point that told Evelyn which direction was which when the clouds moved in and erased everything else. On the fourth night, she saw a fox move through the yard, unhurried, stopping to investigate the barn door and then continuing on. On the seventh night, she heard something in the trees to the north and held herself absolutely still for 40 minutes until a deer emerged, picked its way across the far end of the pasture, and disappeared into the timber on the south side. On the ninth night, the cold was bad enough that she stopped being able to feel her feet and spent an hour working her toes methodically inside her boots, which she suspected was the least dignified thing she had ever done, but her feet recovered, which was the point. On the 11th night, at midnight, she saw a light in the trees. Not a lantern. A shielded light, the kind you made by wrapping a lantern in canvas with only a slit cut in the front, giving you just enough light to see your own footing without broadcasting your position. She'd seen hunters use them. She'd seen other people use them for other purposes. She watched the light move through the trees toward the east end of the barn. She counted. 2 figures. She was certain of 2, and the way the shielded light moved suggested a third might be staying back at the tree line, keeping watch. She needed to warn Silas without alerting whoever was in those trees. They had worked out a signal for this. 3 short whistles, the kind of sound that could be a night bird if you weren't paying close attention. She raised 2 fingers to her mouth and then stopped. The wind had shifted while she was counting the figures. It was coming from the north now, and the sound would carry the wrong direction, away from Silas, toward the tree line where the third figure might be standing. She made a different calculation, fast, the way you do when the plan changes under you, and you have to find the new shape of the situation before the situation finds you first. She came down off the ridge. She came down carefully, no sound, keeping the flat rock shelf between herself and the tree line, until she was on lower ground. Then she moved along the pasture fence toward the south, wide around the yard, staying in the shadow of the fence posts. The Winchester was in her hands, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of her own heartbeat, constant, factual. She was 30 feet from the fence corner where Silas was hidden when she saw him move. He'd seen the light without her signal. He'd already adjusted. She stopped. He came up out of the corner in one controlled motion, and his voice came out loud and hard and certain. "Don't move!" And the 2 figures at the barn wall froze in the sudden shock of a voice from a direction they hadn't accounted for. One of them ran, the other one didn't. The one who didn't run was on the ground before Evelyn fully registered Silas moving, a quick, efficient series of actions she couldn't entirely follow in the dark. A scuffle, brief and decisive. And then a man on the ground with Silas's knee in his back, and the man's own arm twisted up at an angle that suggested cooperation was the better option. The one who'd run. She heard crashing in the brush to the east, heading back to the tree line. She turned toward the tree line, toward where the third figure might be. She raised the Winchester. A shape moved in the trees. Stopped. She could feel the person's awareness of her, the moment of assessment. Who was this? What were they holding? Was the exit to the south clear? She didn't shoot. She didn't move. The shape in the trees moved south and then was gone, and she heard hoofbeats receding in the dark, and then just the wind. She went back to Silas. The man on the ground was breathing hard, face in the dirt, hands now tied behind him with the cord Silas had carried in his coat pocket for 11 nights. Silas had a lantern open now. the cabin lantern, not the shielded kind, and in its light she could see the man was young, mid-20s maybe. A working man's hands, ordinary clothes, nothing distinctive about him except the expression of someone who had very recently understood that the job he'd been paid to do had turned out considerably more difficult than advertised. "What's your name?" Silas said. The man said nothing. "Your name," Silas said again. Not louder, just the same. "Pete," the man finally said. Into the dirt. "Pete Driscoll." "Who sent you up here, Pete?" Silence. "You're going to tell me," Silas said, "or I'm going to take you down to Red Hollow and drop you at the sheriff's office with the evidence I've been collecting since January. Your choice on the timing." More silence. Evelyn stood back and let Silas work, watching Pete Driscoll's face in the lantern light, watching the calculations moving through it, loyalty versus consequence, and the fragile weight of each. "I work for a man named Garrett," Pete said finally. "Supplies labor for the Valley operations. And Garrett works for— I don't know who Garrett works for. I do the jobs, I get paid, I don't ask." He paused. "But the man who came to talk to Garrett, I saw him once, at the supply yard in Red Hollow." Another pause. "He had a son with him. Didn't look like he'd ever done a day of work in his life." Silas and Evelyn looked at each other across the lantern light. Thomas Voss, Malcolm's son, the man who'd slid the letter across the table with 2 fingers. Not just Malcolm, then. Thomas was in it too. She hadn't expected that. She thought she had, but the feeling that moved through her when she heard it was something she'd call surprise, even though it shouldn't have been. Thomas, who hadn't been unkind exactly. Thomas, who just needed things to be convenient. She thought about the letter. A barren woman in this family is a liability. Thomas hadn't written it, but he'd delivered it, and now his father's men were on a mountain in the middle of the night trying to burn down the life she'd built after. She breathed. "Get him inside," she told Silas. Her voice was steady. "And then we need to talk about what we do next." Clara made coffee without being asked, because Clara had learned quickly that this was how she contributed, watching what was needed, moving toward it without announcement. She poured 4 cups, then remembered Pete Driscoll, and poured a 5th, which said something about Clara's character that Evelyn filed away for later. They sat Pete Driscoll at the table, tied to the chair, but not roughly. And Silas set a cup in front of him, and they had a conversation that lasted 2 hours. Pete Driscoll turned out to be a man who'd made a series of decisions that seemed reasonable one at a time and had compounded into something he wasn't proud of. He'd needed work after the mine outside Hadley closed. Garrett had offered steady wages with no questions asked. The first jobs had been ordinary, moving equipment, hauling freight. Then the other kind. The fence, the grain, the horses, the well. He'd been told they were pressuring a rancher to sell, that it was a business matter, that no one was going to get hurt. "The barn," Silas said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "You set the fire." Pete stared at the coffee cup. "We were told to make enough damage that he'd have to take a loan, that once he needed a loan, the bank would work it out from there." "The bank Malcolm Voss owns a controlling interest in," Evelyn said. Pete looked at her. He hadn't expected her to know that. "We think so," she said. "We've been doing our homework." Pete was quiet for a while. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The particular flatness of someone telling the truth because they've decided the calculation has changed. "I didn't know about the woman," he said. "When I took the job, I was told it was just a stubborn rancher. I didn't know about—" He looked at Evelyn. "I didn't know about any of the other part, what they'd done before." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me," he said. "I'm just—" He stopped. "I know," she said. And she did. She knew what it looked like when a person was trying to explain how they'd gotten somewhere they hadn't meant to end up. She was sitting in the evidence of that phenomenon. "What happens to me now?" he asked. Silas and Evelyn looked at each other. "That depends on what you're willing to do," Silas said. Pete Driscoll stayed in the storage room that had been Clara's until they could get him to a lawyer in the county seat. Not under armed guard, they weren't running a jail, but under a clear agreement, he would provide a written statement of everything he knew, signed and witnessed, and in exchange they would advocate with the sheriff for consideration of his cooperation. He could have tried to leave. He didn't. Evelyn spent 3 days writing, She wrote out everything she had: the water diversion evidence they'd been documenting since November, the creek measurements, the upstream tracks, the filed complaint to the Territorial Commission, the accounting records showing the failed Cattle Association approach, and who had funded it. Pete Driscoll's statement, which he'd written in a labored but legible hand and signed without hesitation. The timeline of sabotage events, dated, with physical descriptions of each incident and the evidence they'd preserved. She wrote the covering letter herself, addressed to the Territorial Commissioner's office, and then wrote a second copy addressed to a lawyer in the county seat named Arthur Finch, no relation to Clara, who had a reputation, Bill Henderson said, for taking cases against powerful men. "He won't take it for free," Silas said. "I know." She looked at what she'd assembled. It covered the entire kitchen table. "But he'll take it. This is more documented than anything he's likely seen from this county. And if he doesn't, then we find the next one." Silas stood at the edge of the table, looking at the papers. He'd come inside from the morning work and was still carrying the cold from outside, and his hands were rough, and his coat was worn at the elbows, and he looked at what she'd built over 3 days of writing and said nothing for a long moment. "When I came up to this ranch the first time," he said finally, "I thought I was maybe going to lose it in 2 years. 3 if the weather was good." He was still looking at the papers. "I didn't tell Price that, but that's where I was." She looked at him. "And now?" she asked. He picked up the letter to Arthur Finch, read the first paragraph, set it down. "Now I think we might actually win," he said. It wasn't a dramatic statement. He said it the way he said most things, with the particular quietness of someone who doesn't waste words on anything they don't mean. But it landed in her chest like something she hadn't known she was waiting for. She gathered the papers into order and tied them with cord. "Then let's go to town," she said. They went down the mountain together, which was itself a statement. She understood that, the way you understand anything that's going to be watched and interpreted and discussed in a town that had been telling itself a story about you for months. Red Hollow received them with its usual performance of ordinary life. People going about their business on the main street, horses tied at the rails, a woman sweeping the porch of the hotel. The performance of normalcy that a small town puts on when something is about to break the surface. She felt the glances. She didn't acknowledge them. Arthur Finch's office was above the hardware store, up a flight of stairs that creaked on every step. He was a spare, gray-haired man who received them with the careful courtesy of someone reserving judgment. He read for 45 minutes while they waited. He asked 3 questions, 2 of them about the water claim documentation and 1 about the chain of witness statements. Then he looked up. "This is well organized," he said. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "The water claim is your strongest element. Prior appropriation is clear, and the diversion documentation is extensive." He picked up Pete Driscoll's statement. "This is useful, but a man like Malcolm Voss will dispute his credibility immediately." "He signed it in front of 2 witnesses," Evelyn said. "Bill Henderson and Clara Finch." Finch looked up briefly. "Henderson will hold under cross-examination?" "Yes," Silas said. Finch set the statement down. "The Cattle Association documentation is harder to use directly, but it establishes a pattern that supports the interpretation of intent." He looked at them both. "I'll take the case. Water Commission filing first, that's the cleanest path. The criminal question regarding the sabotage is separate and will take longer." "What do you need from us?" Evelyn asked. "More time, more documentation, and a great deal of patience." He looked at her specifically. "You understand that once this is filed, it will get worse before it gets better." "Yes," she said. "Voss has means and he has allies. He will respond." "He's already responded," she said. "We caught one of his people setting fire to our barn in March." Finch looked at her for a moment. "So I understand the situation," she said. "What does he not have that we do?" A small pause. "The truth, it appears," Finch said, "which is sometimes enough. Not always. But sometimes." They left his office and came out onto the main street, and it was there, standing at the top of the hardware store stairs, that she saw Thomas. He was on the street below, coming out of the bank with 2 other men. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and for a second they were simply looking at each other across the distance of a street, and 8 months, and everything that had happened in between. He looked older, or maybe she was seeing him differently. He had their father's posture now. that contained deliberate walk of a man who's practiced being watched. He looked away first. She watched him walk away down the street, and she felt nothing clean. Not nothing, but nothing simple. A tangle of things she didn't have the time or inclination to pull apart in the middle of Red Hollow's Main Street. Silas was beside her. He'd seen it too. "You all right?" he said, quietly. "Yes," she said. Then, "No, but I will be." She moved toward the stairs. "Let's get the supplies and go home." The word home came out of her mouth without her having chosen it, and she caught it in the air after the fact and held it there, examining it. She'd said it about the ranch without meaning to, which meant somewhere in the past 5 months it had become true. Silas didn't remark on it. She thought he'd noticed. She thought it was entirely like him not to say anything about it. April was almost kind. The creek came back to full flow with the snowmelt, which meant the diversion upstream had stopped, either because Finch's preliminary filing had been received, or because someone had decided the risk wasn't worth it yet. The pasture greened faster than it had the year before, or so Silas said, looking at it with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd watched a specific piece of ground for years. Clara's children ran in that pasture on the warm afternoons, and Clara herself had started helping with the kitchen garden and had opinions about where the beans should go, which Evelyn respected because Clara's instincts about growing things turned out to be sound. The ranch was finding a shape, not the with its odd assembled household of a married couple who hadn't known each other 6 months ago, and a widow and her 2 children, and occasionally Pete Driscoll, who'd taken a position with the Henderson operation after his cooperation was acknowledged, but still sometimes appeared at their door on Sunday evenings because, as he explained awkwardly, he'd started thinking of them as the kind of people he wanted to be near. Evelyn had not expected to find Pete Driscoll tolerable. She found him, reluctantly, not terrible. It was in April that her body started doing strange things. At first she thought it was the change in diet. The ranch's winter stores had been simple, root vegetables and dried meat, and whatever Clara's resourcefulness could stretch. And the spring brought fresh things that her system was apparently adjusting to. She was tired in a way that sleep didn't touch. She was nauseous in the mornings, not every morning, but regularly enough that she started waking earlier and going outside for air before the smell of coffee reached her. She noticed these things. She organized them the way she organized everything, cataloged and considered. And then she put them somewhere and didn't look at them because looking directly at what she thought they might mean felt like the most dangerous thing she'd ever considered doing. She had been told, by 3 doctors, that her body was categorically unable to do this thing. She had been discarded on the basis of that information. She had built an entire architecture of herself around surviving the weight of that verdict. And she was not prepared, she was not ready, she was not able to let herself believe something that, if wrong, would break her in a way she might not recover from. So she didn't look at it. For 3 weeks, she didn't look at it. Until the morning she was in the East Field, working alongside Silas on the fence line repair that the spring thaw had made necessary, and the nausea hit her without warning in a wave that brought her to her knees in the wet grass and left her there, both hands braced against the ground, breathing in the particular careful way of someone managing something physical through sheer decision. Silas was beside her in 5 seconds. "What happened?" "I'm fine," she said. The grass was cold and damp under her palms. She stopped. She felt his hand on her back. Not dramatic, just there. "Evelyn." She looked up at him. His face was close, concerned in the way he was always concerned, without performance, without the overlay of what he was supposed to look like when someone he cared about was on the ground. She said, "I think I need to see a doctor." His expression changed. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that told her that in the time she'd been keeping track of what was happening to her body, he'd been keeping track too. "How long?" he asked. 3 weeks, I've been sure something is different," she said. "Maybe a month before that." She looked at her hands in the grass. "Silas." The doctors who worked for Malcolm Voss said, he said. She looked up at him. "I said it on the first day," he told her. "I said I didn't know what to believe about someone else's body. That's still true." His hand was still on her back. "Let's find a doctor who doesn't owe anyone anything and hear what he says." She stayed there on her knees in the wet grass for a moment longer. The field smelled of thawed earth and new growth. The sky above them was the pale, clean blue of early spring, with cloud. "All right," she said. He helped her up. His hands were careful. The traveling doctor was a man named Harlan Price, not from Red Hollow, who passed through the mountain territories twice a year seeing patients in the outlying ranches and settlements. He'd been recommended by the Henderson brothers as a man who gave his actual opinion rather than the one most convenient for the person paying him. He was 60, gray-bearded, with the quiet manner of someone who delivered enough difficult news to have stopped trying to manage how it landed. He came to Boone Ridge on a Thursday in late April. He spent 20 minutes with Evelyn in the south room. Silas waited at the kitchen table, which Evelyn knew because she could hear the particular stillness of someone working very hard to simply sit. When Harlan Price came out of the south room, he stopped at the kitchen table and looked at Silas. "Your wife," he said, in the direct tone of a man reporting a fact, "is approximately 3 months into a pregnancy." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. "The previous diagnosis," Price continued, setting his bag on the table with a small thump, "was wrong. I can't speak to the reasons it was wrong, whether it was incompetence or something else. What I can tell you is that her constitution is entirely sound. The pregnancy is progressing normally as far as I can determine, and there is no anatomical reason she could not have carried a child before or carry this one to term." Silas said nothing. He was looking at the table. "Mr. Boone," Price said. Silas looked up. His face was doing something she'd never seen it do. Not composed, not contained, but working through something too large for the face it was using. "Congratulations," Price said, simply, the way he'd say it to any man. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the south room and watched her husband's face and found that she was shaking, finally, in her hands, in her knees. Not fear, though there was fear in it. Something larger than fear. Something that didn't have a name she'd been taught to trust. 3 doctors. 3 men who ate dinner at Malcolm Voss's table. 3 years of carrying the verdict they'd written for her like a stone around her throat. And here was an old man with a medical bag setting that stone down on the table as calmly as if he were discussing the weather, and the stone was not what she'd been told it was. It was not a verdict. It had been a lie. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe and breathed. Clara appeared from the garden where she'd been keeping herself busy with what Evelyn recognized now as deliberate tact. And she looked at Evelyn's face and she understood immediately, and she covered her mouth with her hand for a moment. And then she crossed the cabin and put her arms around Evelyn without saying anything at all, which was exactly right. Evelyn let herself be held for a long moment. Then she straightened, wiped her face with the back of her hand. "It's going to change things," she said, to the room, to no one in particular. "Yes," Silas said. He'd stood from the table. He was across the cabin now, and he looked at her directly. "For the better." She thought about Malcolm Voss. She thought about the campaign he was already preparing, the one Arthur Finch had warned them about, the public pressure and the legal challenges and the reputation management of a man who had spent decades making sure the story always went his way. She thought about what it would mean for him to hear this, what he would say, what weapons this gave him, and what it took away. She thought all of this in approximately 4 seconds, and then she set it aside for later because it was later's problem. Right now, in this cabin, in this spring light, there was only this. "All right," she said. She looked at Dr. Price. "Tell me what I need to know." He sat back down at the table and opened his bag, and he talked for an hour, and she listened to every word, and outside the window the creek ran full and clean, and the east field was green all the way to the fence line, and the ranch went on being exactly what it had been the day she'd decided to stay. Hers, theirs. The joke was still running, but it had changed its ending without asking anyone's permission. The news moved down the mountain faster than either of them intended. They hadn't told anyone outside the cabin, hadn't announced it, hadn't written letters, hadn't done anything except live with it quietly for 2 weeks while Evelyn adjusted to what it meant. And Silas fixed 3 fence posts that didn't need fixing and reorganized the tack room twice, which was how he processed things he didn't have words for yet. Clara knew, and kept the knowledge with the same steady discretion she brought to everything. The children didn't know, or knew in the vague way children know things, that something had shifted in the adults around them, that the cabin had a different quality of quiet in the evenings. But Pete Driscoll had been at the Henderson place when Dr. Harlan Price made his return trip through the valley, and Price, who was a private man in most respects, had apparently seen fit to mention to Bill Henderson. in the context of recommending continued monitoring of the pregnancy, that the woman up at Boone Ridge was going to need reliable access to a physician over the coming months. Bill Henderson had the kind of face that couldn't hold a secret if the secret was good news. And by the time Evelyn and Silas came down the mountain the following Friday for supplies, it was evident from the way people looked at them on the main street that something had circulated. Not the whole story, but enough. Evelyn noticed it first in the Mercantile, where the woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Aldrich who had previously managed to look past Evelyn entirely, as though her presence registered at a frequency slightly below visible, met her eyes and then looked quickly away with an expression that was working out whether to be surprised or embarrassed or something else. She mentioned it to Silas on the walk to the feed store. "They know," she said, quietly. He glanced at the street around them, took in the particular texture of the attention they were receiving, nodded once. "Does that change anything?" she asked. "For us?" "No." He held the feed store door open. "For other people, we'll see." What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly the information would reach Malcolm Voss, and how quickly Malcolm Voss would decide what to do with it. She found out 3 days later, when Arthur Finch rode up to Boone Ridge with a letter in his coat pocket and an expression that was carefully professional, which meant the contents were not good. "He's moving faster than I expected," Finch said, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter unfolded between them. "He's filed a counter-complaint with the Territorial Commission disputing your water claim on a technicality. The original filing witness, a man named Orrin Tate, died 2 years ago, and Voss is arguing the witness record is therefore unverifiable." "That's not how prior appropriation works," Evelyn said. "No, it isn't, but it creates delay while the commission sorts it, and delay is what he wants." Finch picked up the letter. "More immediately, he's been talking. To the ranching families who attend the annual gathering in June, he's preparing a public statement." "About what?" Silas asked. Finch looked at Evelyn. "About the pregnancy." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "He's going to claim the child isn't yours," Evelyn said. She said it flat, factual, because she'd already thought of this possibility and had put it on the shelf of things she was tracking. He needs to, because if the pregnancy is legitimate, it demolishes his original justification for the divorce. 3 doctors he arranged said I was unable to conceive. If I'm pregnant, either they were wrong or they lied. He'll choose a third option, Finch said. He'll say the child is not Mr. Boone's. Silas's jaw tightened. It was the only visible change in his expression, but she'd learned to read him well enough that it registered like something considerably louder. If he makes that accusation publicly, Finch continued, at the annual gathering, in front of the ranching community, it becomes the story everyone is discussing instead of the water rights, instead of the sabotage, instead of the fraudulent medical reports. He redirects the conversation to your character rather than his conduct. He's done this before, Evelyn said. With me. He made the conversation about my body rather than about what he'd arranged. Yes, Finch looked at her. He's good at it. She was aware of Silas watching her from across the table, not assessing her response. He wasn't that kind of person, just present, available if she needed something. She didn't need anything yet. She was thinking. When is the gathering? She asked. 2nd Saturday of June. 6 weeks. Yes. And if he makes the accusation publicly, what's our best response? Finch was quiet for a moment. Legally, you could file for defamation. But that's a long road and a slow one, and by the time it resolves, the reputational damage is already done. He turned his pen in his hand. The more effective response would be to be there, to have your evidence visible and your witnesses present, to let him make the statement in front of people who've already seen the documentation. You're saying we should go to the gathering, Silas said. I'm saying if you don't go, he controls the floor. If you do go... Finch paused. It's a risk. He has allies in that room. People who owe him favors, people who've taken his money. It won't be a friendly audience. It wasn't friendly before, Evelyn said. Finch looked at her carefully. I'll go, she said. We'll go. He gathered his papers. Then let's use the 6 weeks well. They used them very well. The water diversion complaint was what they worked on first, because Finch's assessment was right. It was the cleanest legal line they had, and strengthening it meant more documentation, more testimony, more evidence that couldn't be explained away by attacking Evelyn's character or the validity of her marriage. Silas spent 2 weeks making a systematic survey of the creek, measuring flow rates at marked points from the source to where it crossed onto Boone Ridge, recording each measurement with date and time and weather conditions in a ledger that Evelyn kept in a waterproof case she'd made herself from treated canvas. She went with him on most of those surveys, walking the creek line in her boots, with the pregnancy now making itself known through a certain heaviness she was adjusting to, measuring and noting and building a record that was meticulous enough to be unassailable. Bill Henderson contributed his own water measurements and a sworn statement about the history of the creek flow, which he'd been observing from his adjacent operation for 12 years. He signed it in front of Finch and 2 other witnesses. The Henderson brothers brought 2 other mountain ranchers to Finch's office to give testimony about the Cattle Association, men who'd been approached by Cutter, who had declined for their own reasons, and who were willing to say so in writing. Neither of them was a friend to Malcolm Voss. One of them had a history with him that predated the water dispute by a decade and had been waiting for an occasion to document it. Voss makes enemies slowly, Bill Henderson observed one evening at the kitchen table, where he'd come to go over the survey records with Silas. He makes them carefully, one at a time, in ways that don't look like enmity. But they add up. He thinks he's been subtle, Silas said. He has been subtle. That's the problem. Bill turned a page in the ledger. But subtle and thorough aren't the same thing. He's thorough about the people he thinks matter, the ones he dismisses. He glanced at Evelyn without completing the sentence. Come back to bite him, she said. That's the hope. The medical records were what she spent her own evenings on. Not just the 3 original doctors. She wrote to the Territorial Medical Board requesting records of complaints or sanctions against each of them. She wrote to doctors in 2 neighboring counties requesting professional assessments of the diagnostic criteria used. She wrote to Harlan Price, who sent back a 3-page letter in a precise, unhurried hand that dissected the original diagnosis and identified 4 specific clinical errors, each of which, Price wrote, would be considered elementary to any practitioner with current training and professional diligence. She put that letter in the waterproof case with the creek measurements. She also found the paper trail. It was in the county property records, which were public and which she'd been meaning to examine since the conversation about Malcolm Voss's bank interest. She went to the county office on a Wednesday when Silas was meeting with Finch, and she spent 4 hours going through records that no one had apparently organized with any system that made sense to anyone except the county clerk who'd invented it. She found what she was looking for in a folder that had been misfiled under an incorrect date and appeared to have been sitting in the wrong drawer for 3 years. 2 property transfers, both in the year before her marriage to Thomas. A ranch to the north of Red Hollow and one to the east, both acquired by Voss Land Holdings within 6 months of the families who owned them, defaulting on loans held by the bank in which Malcolm Voss held controlling interest. Both families had left the territory. Neither had been heard from since, and attached to the second transfer, a letter in a hand she recognized. Not Malcolm's hand, but a hand she'd seen in business correspondence during her marriage, from a lawyer named Sutter, who was no longer practicing in the county, detailing the arrangement by which the medical assessments of the wives in both families had been used to manufacture grounds for divorce, freeing both men to make more advantageous remarriages and, incidentally, to sell their land to settle debts at prices considerably below market value. She sat in the county clerk's office for a long moment. It had happened before, with 2 other women, before her. She'd been the third. She made copies of everything in her own hand, careful and exact, and had the county clerk witness and stamp the originals, and she walked out into the afternoon and stood on the street in the June warmth and thought about 2 women she'd never met, who had been handed the same letter she'd been handed, and who had left the territory and not been heard from. She thought about what it had taken from them, what it had cost them. She thought about what it had been designed to take from her. Then she went to Finch's office and laid the copies on his desk and watched his expression change as he read. "He's done this before," Finch said. Not a question. At least twice. Finch read the letter from Sutter twice, set it down, picked it up again. "This is criminal," he said. "Not civil. This is conspiracy to defraud, and that's before we get to the property transfers. Can you use it?" He looked at her. "Where are the originals?" "Stamped and witnessed at the county clerk's office, filed under the property record reference." She put the reference number on a piece of paper and slid it across to him. He looked at the number, looked at her. "You found this yourself," he said. "Yes." "In 4 hours." 3.5. He was quiet for a moment. Where were you before this, Miss Mercer? What did you do before Red Hollow decided what you were? She looked at the window. I was someone's wife, she said. I kept the household accounts and went to church and tried to make myself small enough to stay where I'd been put. She looked back at him. I prefer this. Finch gathered the papers carefully. We have enough, he said. We have more than enough. For the gathering? For the gathering. And for what comes after. June arrived green and warm, and the gathering was held, as it always was, on the flat ground along the river outside Red Hollow. A day-long affair that had begun as a practical meeting of the ranching families of the territory and had accumulated, over the years, the additional function of being the place where the community's understanding of itself was negotiated and performed. Evelyn had been to the gathering twice during her marriage to Thomas. Both times she'd attended as an accessory, present but not speaking, visible but not participating in anything that mattered. She remembered the tables under the trees, the smell of wood smoke and horses, the way the men naturally organized themselves by wealth and influence into configurations that made the social order visible without anyone having to name it. She wore her good dress, which she'd let out at the waist the previous week with Clara's help. Clara was practical about sewing and had done the work without comment, except to say the green was a good color on her, which was the kind of thing Clara said that always sounded like she meant it because she did. Silas wore his good coat, which had been brushed and was only slightly too large for him because he'd lost weight over the hard winter and hadn't replaced it yet. He looked like what he was, a working rancher who'd put on his best for an occasion he was attending on purpose, not as anyone's guest. They arrived in the wagon, which was also on purpose, not on horseback, not slipping in quietly. They drove in on the main track with Finch riding alongside, and Bill Henderson and his brother Roy coming in behind, and they parked at the far end of the field where the other wagons were and walked in together. She felt the gathering register their arrival. It moved through the crowd the way things move through crowds. Not all at once, but in a wave of redirected attention, of conversations paused, of glances exchanged. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and her hands loose at her sides. Malcolm Voss was at the central table with a group of men she recognized, valley ranchers, the land broker Cutter, two other men she couldn't name, but whose posture communicated that they were there in support of something. Malcolm looked older than she remembered, which surprised her. She'd been carrying a fixed image of him in her head, the composed, certain face of a man who's never doubted his own authority. And the actual man was older and somehow smaller than the image. He saw her. She watched him see her. Whatever calculation he made took about 3 seconds. He looked away. The gathering proceeded through its ordinary business for the first 2 hours. Water table reports, grazing season updates, the usual negotiation over shared trail access that happened every year and never quite resolved. Evelyn sat with Silas and Finch at one of the outer tables, and people came to them. Not many, and not the most powerful ones, but more than she'd expected. The two ranchers who'd given testimony came and sat for a while. Pete Driscoll appeared briefly, still carrying his particular combination of guilt and improving character. A woman Evelyn didn't know very well, wife of one of the valley ranchers, stopped and said simply, "I heard about the pregnancy. Congratulations." She said it quickly, quietly, and moved away before Evelyn could respond. And Evelyn understood that this woman had her own accounting to settle with Malcolm Voss. And this was how she was doing it, one small, deniable piece of evidence that she was paying attention. When Malcolm Voss stood to address the gathering, the day had reached late afternoon, the light going golden across the field. He had a voice that carried without effort, a practiced voice, a man who'd been addressing rooms for decades. He began with the water rights question, framing it as a matter of territorial development, of whether the mountain operations were going to cooperate with the valley for the good of the whole territory, or hold their water access as private leverage. He was measured. He was reasonable. He cited numbers she recognized from the Cattle Association materials and presented them without attribution, as though they were simply facts about the world rather than a case he'd constructed. Then he turned to Boone Ridge. "It's been brought to my attention," he said, in the tone of a man who regrets having to raise a difficult matter, "that there are claims circulating about the situation up at Boone Ridge that deserve to be examined carefully. Claims that, if accepted without scrutiny, could reflect poorly on the integrity of this community's standards." The gathering was quiet. A woman was diagnosed by qualified physicians as being constitutionally unable to bear children. That woman subsequently, through what I can only describe as an unusual series of events, became pregnant while living in circumstances that were, by any objective account, irregular. He paused. He was very good at pauses. I'm not saying anything specific, he continued. I'm simply asking the community to apply the same standards of verification to these claims that we would apply to any other claim made in this territory. It was masterful, she thought. It accused without accusing. It cast doubt while appearing to request only fairness. It was exactly the thing she'd watched him do at the Founders' Day gathering 2 years ago, and it worked because it didn't give you anything specific to push against. She stood up. Not planned exactly. She'd planned to let Finch lead the response, had gone over it with him twice, knew the order in which the documents would be presented. But she stood up first, and the standing was the thing, and Finch, to his credit, simply adjusted. "Mr. Voss," she said. Her voice was level. The gathering could hear her clearly. She'd placed herself at the outer table specifically because the acoustics of this field carried from there. "I appreciate you bringing this before the community. I'd like to do the same." He looked at her. She could see him recalculating. "I have documentation," she said, "that I'd like the community to examine. Actual documents, not claims, not impressions. Records from the territorial offices, medical assessments, county property records, and signed witness statements. I'd like to read them into the public record of this gathering." She looked at the gathering's recording secretary, a woman named Mrs. Plum, who had held the position for 9 years and was known to be scrupulously nonpartisan because she found partisanship administratively inconvenient. "Mrs. Plum," she said, "may I?" Mrs. Plum, who had the expression of a person watching something historically significant happen in front of her, said, "The floor recognizes Mrs. Boone." She took the documents from Finch, who had arranged them in the correct order while she was standing, and she began. She read for 40 minutes. She read clearly, without editorial comment, without argument. The water claim filing and its dates. The upstream diversion measurements. Henderson's witness statement. The medical board inquiry results, including the specific errors identified by Harlan Price. The 2 previous property transactions, the misfiled letter from Sutter, the pattern it documented. Pete Driscoll's signed statement, which she read in full, including his description of the man who'd come to talk to Garrett at the supply yard. A man with a son who looked like he'd never worked a day in his life. She heard Thomas's voice then, somewhere in the gathering, a sharp intake of breath, or something like it. She didn't look up. She kept reading. When she finished, the gathering was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. The before quiet had been the quiet of people performing attention. This was the quiet of people actually thinking. Malcolm Voss said, "Those documents are stamped and witnessed at the county clerk's office," Finch said. He was on his feet now. "Originals are available for examination. We have brought 3 of them today." He held up the leather folder. "Anyone who would like to verify in person may do so at this table." Malcolm Voss looked at the folder, then at Finch, then at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "The medical reports," he said. His voice was still controlled, but something had changed in it. A quality of purchase, of a man who's been standing on solid ground and has just put his foot down on something that moved. "The original physicians made their assessment based on—" "Their assessment was wrong," said a voice from the back of the gathering. Everyone turned. Harlan Price had come. She hadn't known he was going to come. She hadn't asked him to. He was standing at the back of the gathering in his traveling coat, his medical bag at his feet, looking exactly like what he was. A man who'd made the ride out here for a reason. "I examined Mrs. Boone myself in April," he said. "She is approximately 5 months pregnant. Her constitution is entirely sound. The original diagnosis, as I've indicated in my written assessment, contained 4 identifiable clinical errors that any physician of ordinary competence would have avoided." He looked at Malcolm Voss with the professional calm of a man who doesn't have a stake in anyone's feelings. "If you'd like to discuss the specifics, I'm available. But the diagnosis was wrong. That's my professional conclusion." Malcolm Voss was silent. Hector Price, sitting 2 seats away from him, was looking at the table in front of him. Thomas Voss. She found him now. Standing at the edge of the gathering, not at his father's table, but off to the side, slightly apart, in the posture of a man who has just discovered that the structure he thought he was standing inside is not load-bearing. She watched her ex-husband's face. He knew. He had probably known, or suspected, for long enough that the knowing had settled into something dull and permanent rather than acute. She watched the dull thing acknowledge itself in his expression, and she felt, not satisfaction, not the sharp, clean pleasure of being right that she'd perhaps imagined she would feel. Just something tired, something finished. The gathering broke into its own noise after that. Not chaos. These were mostly pragmatic people, but the particular sound of a community revising the story. It had been telling itself, which is always a complicated sound, full of cross-currents and competing versions. Cutter left quickly. Two of the men who'd been sitting with Malcolm stood and moved away from the table, the specific movement of people separating themselves from something they now considered poorly attached to. Malcolm himself remained where he was, which she respected, perversely. He didn't flee. He sat at the table with the particular composure of a man who has taken a significant blow and decided to take it on his feet, or in this case seated, rather than stagger. He was looking at her when she finally walked toward him. She hadn't planned to, but she found herself walking that direction while Silas was talking with Bill Henderson and Finch was managing the queue of people who wanted to examine the original documents. She stopped at the edge of the table. He looked up at her. 3 women, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. I found the records on the other 2. Before me. Something moved in his face. Not guilt exactly. The older cousin of guilt, recognition, the particular acknowledgement of a man who has known for some time that this moment was coming and has been deciding how to wear it. What do you want? He said. Also quiet. I don't want anything from you, she said. I want you to understand that I know everything. She looked at him steadily. Finch is filing the full case with the territorial court next week. Water rights, property fraud, the medical arrangement, all of it. She held his gaze. You have time to make this less damaging to the people around you who didn't choose to be part of it. Your son, for instance. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Thomas isn't a good man, she said, but he's not what you are. I'm not sure he knew the full shape of it. She paused. I could be wrong about that. You're not wrong, Malcolm said, very quietly. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she walked away. Back to the table where Silas was standing. Back to Finch and Bill Henderson and the small core of people who had chosen to place themselves on this side of the line. Silas handed her a cup of water without being asked. She drank it. All right? He asked. Yes. She looked back once at the central table, where Malcolm Voss sat alone now, his allies redistributed across the gathering. Yes, I think so. It wasn't over. She knew that. The territorial court case would take months, possibly a year. There would be lawyers and filings and counterarguments and the particular grinding patience required of people who are fighting institutions. Malcolm Voss would not simply absorb this afternoon and become a different man. He would adapt and maneuver and deploy whatever resources remained to him because that was what he knew how to do. But something had broken. Not just in the room, not just in the afternoon. She could feel it in the specific quality of how people were moving and speaking and looking at each other. The story had changed. And once a story changes this publicly, in front of this many people, the old version doesn't fully come back. The walk back to their wagon, at the end of the gathering, was different from the walk in. People made space, not theatrically, not the performative deference of people who've decided who the winner is, just space, of the kind that indicates that a person is recognized, that their presence registers in the ordinary human way of, here is someone who exists, here is someone withstanding, here is someone who is not what we were told. She carried the documents under her arm and walked through the evening field and helped Silas with the wagon and climbed up beside him and turned once to look back at Red Hollow in the golden late light. It went well, she said. It went very well, Finch said from his horse alongside. Silas said nothing. He picked up the reins, clicked to the horse. The wagon moved forward, up toward the mountain, toward home. The word that had arrived in her mouth without planning and had stayed there, settled, accurate. Behind them, Red Hollow went on doing what it always did, telling itself a story. But the story was different now, and it was going to stay different, and that was the most that anyone could ask of a day. The road curved into the trees, and the gathering disappeared behind them, and the evening came down clean and cool, and she put her hand over the small, certain roundness at her midsection and felt the particular quality of a life that was, against considerable odds, entirely her own. She wasn't done, but she was ahead. That was enough for today. The baby came in the first week of September, during a rain that had been building for 3 days and finally arrived with the particular conviction of weather that has made up its mind. It was not an easy labor. Evelyn had not expected it to be easy. She wasn't given to expecting ease from things. But the length of it surprised her. 17 hours from the first real contraction to the moment Dr. Harlan Price, who had ridden up the mountain through the rain the previous afternoon and had been waiting with the patient resignation of a man who'd done this many times, finally said, "There he is," in the quiet tone of someone delivering a fact. She was exhausted in a way that had passed through pain and come out the other side into something that didn't have a name she knew. Her hands were shaking. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came out lower than usual. "Is he all right?" "He's fine," Price said. "Healthy. Good lungs. You'll find that out shortly." He was right about the lungs. Clara brought the baby to her while Price finished what needed finishing, and Evelyn looked at the small, red, furious face of her son and felt something move through her that was not what she'd expected, not the clean wave of love she'd been told about, not the immediate perfection of the feeling. It was messier than that. It was enormous and frightening, and it sat on her chest like a physical weight. The understanding that this person was here now, and she was responsible for him, and nothing that had happened before had prepared her for the specific scale of it. She held him anyway, tightly, because he seemed to require it. He stopped crying within about a minute. "That's something," Clara said softly. Price had sent Pete Driscoll, who had appeared at the ranch 2 days earlier for no stated reason other than that he seemed to understand his presence might be useful, to find Silas. Silas had been in the barn for most of the labor, not because he'd been asked to stay there, but because he had made the calculation that being in the cabin meant being present at something he couldn't help with, and being unable to help was harder on him than the alternative. He came in from the rain, coat dark with it, hat dripping, and stopped in the doorway of the south room. She watched him see the baby. His face did the same thing it had done when Harlan Price had told him about the pregnancy. That movement of something too large for the usual architecture of his expression, working its way through without a map. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his hands, and he held his son for the first time with the careful grip of a man who knows his own strength and is actively managing it. He looked at the baby for a long time without saying anything. "He has your nose," Clara said from the doorway, and then immediately retreated, which was good instinct. Silas looked at Evelyn. "You all right?" he asked. His voice was rougher than usual. "I will be," she said. "I'm very tired." He nodded. He was still holding the baby, who had gone back to sleep with the complete trust of a creature who has not yet learned that the world requires caution. "I've been thinking about what to call him," she said. "What did you decide?" "I haven't yet. I wanted to ask you." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him look at his son's face. "Henry," he said finally. "After my father." She hadn't known his father's name. There were still things she didn't know about him after nearly a year. She suspected there would always be things she didn't know, and had come to find that ordinary rather than concerning. You didn't need the complete map of a person to build a life alongside them. You needed enough. They had enough. "Henry," she said. It fit. "All right." Price appeared in the doorway. "I'll come back in a week. Keep him warm. Keep her rested." He looked at Silas. "She did all the hard work. Your job is to be useful." "I know my job," Silas said. Price left. Pete Driscoll made coffee, which everyone pretended was normal, because by this point Pete Driscoll making coffee in their kitchen was close enough to normal that it barely needed comment. The rain came down outside, steady and serious, and the baby slept in his father's arms, and Evelyn closed her eyes for just a moment in the particular exhausted peace of someone who has arrived somewhere they worked very hard to get. The territorial court ruling came in November. Arthur Finch brought it up the mountain himself, which told her something about how he felt about it before she'd even opened the document. He had the look of a man who has been carrying good news carefully, the way you carry something fragile, not wanting to drop it before it reaches the person it belongs to. The ruling was complete. Malcolm Voss's water diversion had been found in violation of Boone Ridge's prior appropriation claim. The upstream structure his people had built was ordered removed within 30 days. The Territorial Water Commission ordered restoration of full flow to the creek and imposed a penalty that was not large by valley standards but was public, which was worse. The fraud case, the property transfers, the medical arrangement, the two families before Evelyn moved more slowly because it was criminal rather than civil, and because Malcolm Voss had lawyers who were paid specifically to make things move slowly. But it moved. It was moving. Finch had connected with lawyers in the capital who had an interest in the pattern it documented, and there were two other cases they'd found that Finch hadn't told her about before, he'd wanted to be certain, that extended the pattern further back, further than she'd known. "He's done this since before you were married to Thomas," Finch said, sitting at the kitchen table with the papers spread before him. "The water rights consolidation scheme goes back at least 12 years. The medical arrangement with the three doctors was a tool he developed to accelerate it. He needed heirs out of marriages he couldn't otherwise dissolve without scandal." She looked at the documents. "How many women?" Finch was quiet for a moment. "We've identified 5 with certainty. There may be others." She sat with that. 5 women who had been handed letters in their kitchens and told what they were. 5 women who had built their lives around a verdict that was manufactured for someone else's convenience. She didn't know their names except for the 2 she'd found in the county records. She thought about them, the way you think about people you'll never meet who've been through something you understand from the inside. "Will the court account for them?" she asked. "The prosecution will use the pattern," Finch said. "Each case strengthens the argument that this was deliberate and systemic rather than isolated. It goes to intent." He picked up his pen. "I can't promise you what the outcome looks like. He has resources, and this will take time, but the direction is clear." She nodded. "What about Thomas?" Silas asked. He'd been listening from across the room, the baby asleep against his shoulder, in the particular collapsed posture of a man who'd learned to hold a small child and do other things simultaneously. Finch was careful with his answer. "Thomas's exposure is limited. There's evidence he knew about the medical arrangement. At minimum, he was aware the reports were commissioned by his father rather than independently ordered. But proving criminal intent requires showing he understood the full scheme, and that's harder." He paused. "He's cooperated with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office, voluntarily." Evelyn looked up. "He came forward 2 weeks ago," Finch said, "gave a statement. It corroborates the medical arrangement and names the doctors directly." He looked at her. "I don't know what his reasons were. I thought you should know." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Thomas on the street at Red Hollow, looking at her across the distance and then looking away. She thought about his face at the gathering, at the edge of the crowd, the posture of a man discovering the weight of a structure he'd been leaning on. She didn't know what to do with Thomas. She suspected she would never entirely know. He wasn't a villain in the way his father was a villain, carefully, intentionally, over years and at the cost of other people's lives. Thomas was something less dramatic and, in some ways, harder to resolve. A person who had taken the easier option every single time it was offered, until the easier options had compounded into something that implicated him. She couldn't forgive him. She wasn't sure she needed to. He'd done what he'd done, and it had cost her 2 years of her life and a marriage and a place she'd thought was home. And those things didn't unhappen because he'd eventually told the truth. But he'd eventually told the truth. She filed that next to everything else in the ledger of him and left it there. "All right," she said. "What do we need to do next?" Malcolm Voss's empire, as Finch had predicted, did not collapse all at once. It collapsed in the way that large structures collapse when the foundation gives, slowly at first, then with acceleration, then all at once. The water ruling was the first break. The ranching families who'd been in negotiation with the Cattle Association withdrew when the ruling became public because the water rights were the primary leverage the association had offered, and the ruling demonstrated those rights were not Voss's to negotiate with. Cutter quietly dissolved the association and left the territory within the month. Price, who had more flexibility in his loyalties than most, began appearing at Bill Henderson's property for conversations that Pete Driscoll reported without anyone asking him to, because Pete had developed the habit of useful observation. The 2 doctors who were still practicing recanted their original assessments in writing, under the pressure of the medical board inquiry. The third had retired to another state and proved harder to reach, but the board found sufficient grounds to take action on the testimony of the other 2 alone. Their licenses were suspended. The suspension was reported in the territory's main newspaper, which ran a brief account of the case that named Malcolm Voss and described the water rights dispute without going into the full detail of the medical arrangement, because the criminal case was still ongoing and the editor was appropriately cautious. It was enough. The newspaper account was enough. The Valley families who'd done business with Voss for years began a quiet renegotiation of their relationships with him. Not all of them, and not immediately, because people don't turn on their alliances quickly when the alliances have been financially useful. But enough of them, and with enough consistency, that by the following spring Malcolm Voss's position in the territory had contracted visibly. He still had his land. He still had his house. He still had the bank interest, though 2 board members had tendered resignations and their replacements were not his appointments. He was not destroyed. She hadn't expected him to be destroyed? That wasn't how it worked. Not in the territory, not for men with his resources and his years of building structural protection around himself. But he was smaller. He was reduced. The specific power he'd had, the ability to shape the story, to arrange the facts, to decide what a person was worth, and make that verdict stick. That power had been interrupted publicly in front of witnesses, with documentation that couldn't be erased. That was what she'd gone to the gathering for. Not his destruction, his interruption. Thomas came to Boone Ridge in the spring, which she hadn't expected and Silas had suspected might happen. She saw the horse from the cabin window. A good horse. Thomas had always had good horses. It was one of the things she'd noted about him early on. And she stood at the window for a moment, watching him come up the track, and then she went outside to meet him. He pulled up at the edge of the yard, looked at her. He looked older in a way that wasn't just time. Something had gone out of him that had previously given him a particular smoothness of surface. He looked like a man who'd recently stopped pretending something, and the stopping had left marks. "I should have come before," he said. He didn't get down from the horse. "You're here now," she said. "I wanted you to know what I said to the prosecutor. I should have said it sooner. I should have—" He stopped, started again. "There were things I knew that I told myself I didn't know. I kept making it smaller in my head until I could fit it somewhere I didn't have to look at." She stood in the yard in the spring morning and looked at the man she'd been married to for 6 years and felt the distance between what he was and what she'd needed him to be, and understood that the distance had always been there and that she had also spent a long time making it smaller in her head. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quickly. "I know that's not good," she said, "because I don't know if I can, and I'm not going to tell you something I'm not sure of." He nodded. That landed on him. She could see it, but he didn't flinch away from it. "There's something I want to tell you," he said. "Something I should have told you 3 years ago." He looked at her steadily. "My father commissioned those reports before you and I were ever in trouble, before there was any reason to question anything. He had it arranged when we were still—" He stopped, breathed. "He always intended to remove you, when he found the right opportunity. The reports were already prepared." He looked at his hands on the reins. "It was never about you failing at something. There was nothing you could have done differently." She stood in the yard. She'd known this, she realized. She'd known it in the way you know things before you have the evidence to confirm them, as a shape in the dark that you've been navigating around for a long time without being able to name it. The 3 doctors commissioned before there was cause, the timing that was too convenient, Malcolm's control that was too complete. She'd known it, and having it said out loud still hit her somewhere she wasn't ready for. She breathed. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me." He nodded. He looked at the cabin, at the yard, at the ranch in the spring light. "You built something real here," he said. He wasn't flattering her. He was just saying what he saw. "Yes," she said. He gathered his reins. "I'm leaving the territory. I'm going to Colorado. I have—" He paused. "It's a fresh start. Maybe I can manage one." She thought about that, about whether he could. She genuinely didn't know. He was not a good man, but he was not entirely what his father was, and there was a small sliver of possibility in that distinction. What he did with it was his own problem now. "Good luck," she said. And she meant it, provisionally. The way you mean it when you genuinely don't know whether a person has what it takes, but you're not going to spend your energy deciding for them. He rode back down this mountain. Silas came out of the barn. She was still standing in the yard. All right? He asked. Yes. She turned. He said it was arranged before we were ever in trouble. The reports were prepared in advance. Silas looked at her. I already believed that, she said. But hearing it is different. How different? She thought about it. It means I spent 2 years blaming something in myself that was never true. Not the pregnancy part. I mean, the sense that I'd failed, that I'd been tried and found insufficient. She looked at the track where Thomas had gone. It was constructed. The whole verdict was constructed before I'd even had a chance to fail. Silas was quiet. That should make me angry, she said. It does make me angry, but it also makes it… She stopped. It wasn't about me. It was never about me. I was just the person who happened to be standing in the position he needed empty. That's not a comfort, Silas said. No, she agreed. But it's a clarification, and clarifications are useful. He came and stood beside her. Not touching, just beside, the way he often was, present without requiring acknowledgement of his presence. You never blamed yourself, he said. I watched you from the first day. You were angry, but you didn't carry it as your failure. I did sometimes, she said, in the middle of the night, when I couldn't sleep. In the first weeks here, when I wasn't sure this was going to work. She looked at him. I just didn't let it be the loudest thing. That's the difference, he said. She thought about that. About the women she'd found in the county records, who'd left the territory, who hadn't been heard from. She hoped they'd found their clarification somewhere. She hoped they'd found the thing she'd found, however they'd found it. The understanding that a verdict delivered by someone who needed you to fail was not a verdict about you. She couldn't know. She could only know her own version of it. Henry began crying from inside the cabin. The sound carried clear and direct through the morning air, with the authority of someone who considers delay in meeting his needs to be a matter of policy failure. She went inside. What came after was not simple, and she would have been suspicious of it if it had been. The territorial court issued its full ruling on the Voss fraud case 18 months after the gathering. Malcolm Voss was found liable for fraud and conspiracy in the property transfers. He was not imprisoned. He had lawyers and resources and a deteriorating health situation that the court took under advisement. But he was ordered to pay restitution to the families whose land had been taken, and to Evelyn specifically for the damage caused by the fraudulent medical assessment. The restitution was a number Arthur Finch said was fair. Evelyn said she didn't care about the number as much as the ruling, and Finch said that was very admirable, and also the number mattered, and she conceded this. The two families she'd found in the county records were located through the court proceedings. One family had rebuilt in Wyoming and came forward to participate in the case. The other could not be found. She thought about the other family sometimes, thought about them finding out eventually, through some chain of news that made its way to wherever they'd gone, that the thing done to them had been named and ruled on. She hoped they found out. She hoped it helped, even a little. She'd learned by now that knowing the truth of what happened to you doesn't undo the happening, but it changes the weight of it. It gives it a shape you can hold instead of something formless that sits on you in the dark. The 5 doctors who'd participated in the scheme across the years lost their licenses. 2 of the 3 who'd assessed Evelyn specifically faced additional sanctions in the state medical board proceedings that followed. She didn't attend those proceedings. Finch kept her informed. She read his summaries and filed them and went back to work, because the ranch required work and Henry required attention, and the cases were Finch's cases now, his professional territory, and she had her own territory to manage. The ranch itself had grown in ways she'd started to be able to see clearly, which meant they'd passed the stage where survival was the primary question and were into something more complicated and more interesting. The horse operation was the heart of it. Silas's skill and her organizational structure had turned it into something with a reputation, quiet but solid. Ranchers from as far as 3 counties away sent difficult horses to Boone Ridge, horses that other operations had given up on, and Silas worked them with the patient directness he brought to everything, and they came back sound. She managed the accounts and the correspondence and the growing complexity of the business with the same systematic attention she'd brought to the feed store ledger years ago, except now it was hers, and the satisfaction of it was correspondingly different. Clara had not left. This was not the original plan. Clara had always framed her stay as temporary, as a winter arrangement while she found her footing. But footing, once found, tends to hold. And by the following spring, Clara had stopped framing it as temporary and had simply become part of the structure of the place. She was skilled at things Evelyn was not: growing, preserving, the domestic management that Evelyn found functional rather than engaging. And she did these things with a quiet competence that made the cabin, and then, as the ranch expanded, the larger house they built in the second year, run with considerably less chaos than it would have otherwise. Her children grew up at Boone Ridge, which was not what Clara had planned, and was entirely what happened. The boy, Daniel, took to horses with a conviction that delighted Silas, and gave Clara minor heart failure on a rotating basis. The girl, Anna, had her mother's growing instinct and could identify 12 kinds of edible plants at 7 years old, which Evelyn documented in a small notebook because it seemed important to document. Pete Driscoll never quite left either, though he maintained the Henderson operation as his official employment. He appeared with sufficient regularity and was sufficiently useful when he appeared that Silas eventually offered him a position, which Pete accepted with the particular relief of a person who's been waiting to be asked something he didn't know how to ask for himself. She watched the ranch accumulate people the way Silas had said his father's land had once accumulated debt. Not by plan, but by the logic of what it was. Boone Ridge had become the kind of place that people found when they needed to find something, which was partly the reputation for fairness and partly something more atmospheric. People said it felt like a place where you could actually breathe. She didn't know how a place got that quality. She suspected it had something to do with the way the people in it treated each other, the particular attention Silas paid to decency as a daily practice rather than an occasion. A cowboy arrived one February with a broken arm and no money, and the look of someone who'd used up the last of several options. Silas set him up in the bunk room they'd added on the east side of the barn and gave him work he could do with one hand while the other healed. He stayed 8 months. When he left, he sent a letter from Colorado that said simply, "The arm healed right. Thank you." A widow from the southern part of the territory appeared in the fall of the third year with 2 draft horses and a claim on a piece of land adjacent to the Henderson brothers' operation that was being disputed by a valley rancher who had, improbably, a distant connection to the Voss family's old network. Evelyn wrote 3 letters on her behalf and connected her with Finch, and the widow kept her land. She sent preserves the following Christmas. She sent preserves every Christmas after that. Evelyn didn't tell these stories as a matter of pride. She didn't tell them at all, really. Other people told them, the way people tell stories about places that have become part of the territory's understanding of itself. She heard versions of the stories about herself and Silas sometimes, from people who didn't know they were talking to the people in the story, and the versions were always slightly different from what she remembered, slightly simplified, slightly cleaner in their arc. She never corrected them. The truth was messier. The truth was 17 hours of labor and a husband who'd managed his feelings about it by fixing fence posts that didn't need fixing. The truth was a night in March on a cold rock shelf with a Winchester and feet that had gone numb, and a man tied to a chair in her kitchen, and 3.5 hours in a county record office with a misfiled folder that changed everything. The truth was a conversation with a man on a horse in the yard who told her that the verdict had been written before the trial, and the particular specific grief of understanding that, and going inside to feed her son anyway because he was hungry, and that was the next thing. Stories want the clean version. She understood why. The clean version was easier to carry, but the real version was what had actually happened. And what had actually happened was that she and Silas were ordinary people with an ordinary share of flaws and limitations who had made a series of decisions in a specific order. And the decisions had accumulated into something that looked, from the outside, like resilience or purpose, or some quality of character that made a good story. From the inside, it had mostly looked like the next thing that needed doing. That was the part no story ever quite captured, and she'd stopped expecting it to. Henry was 3 when she found the 2 copies of the original medical report in an old envelope at the bottom of the wooden box Silas kept under the bed, the box with the water claim and the land grant and the early letters. She hadn't put it there. She'd last seen it the day she gave it to Finch, and she'd assumed it had gone into the case files. Silas must have gotten a copy made without telling her, and kept it, without telling her, in the box with the things he considered important to preserve. She stood with it in her hands for a moment. He came in from outside, looked at her, looked at what she was holding. "You kept this," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, leaning against the doorframe with the afternoon light behind him. "Because I wanted to make sure we didn't lose track of what they said," he said. "What was said about you, so we could always look at it and know exactly what we'd disproved." She looked down at the paper. The formal language. The signatures of 3 men who had since lost their licenses. The verdict that had been constructed to serve someone else's purpose, at her expense, before she'd even been given a chance to live. She thought about the woman who had sat at a kitchen table and read this for the first time, who had folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket and gone back outside to finish hanging laundry because the sheets still needed to dry and collapsing on the floor wouldn't change anything. That woman had made good decisions, had carried her anger at the right temperature. Not so hot it burned through her, not so cold it stopped being useful. Had gone up a mountain to meet a stranger because the alternative was staying in a story someone else had written for her, and she had too much left to do to accept that story as final. She set the report back in the box. "Keep it," she said. He nodded. Henry appeared from the other room in the determined toddle of someone who has recently mastered forward motion and treats it as a calling. He made directly for Silas, who caught him at knee level with the practiced reflexes of a man who's been intercepting small projectiles for 3 years, and swung him up. The boy grabbed his father's collar and looked at Evelyn with the expression he'd developed lately of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting and is ready for its next offering. She looked at the two of them. She thought about a room above a dry goods store with a sloped ceiling. She thought about a creek crossing in September with a gray mare named Sugar and the cold water spraying bright. She thought about 2 tin cups on a table and a man who said this ranch is yours too without any particular ceremony because he wasn't a person who performed things he meant plainly. She thought about how much of her life had been built in the space between someone's contempt and her own refusal to accept it as definition. That was the thing she'd learned, if she had to say she'd learned something. The thing she'd pass on, if anyone asked, which occasionally now they did, because the territory had started sending its people to Boone Ridge with questions as well as broken horses and nowhere to go. What she'd say was this: the verdict that counts is not the one issued about you. It's the one you issue about yourself, quietly, in private, on an ordinary morning when you decide whether to believe the story someone else wrote or to pick up a pen. She'd picked up a pen. That was all. That was the whole of it. Simple, except for the 17 hours of labor and the 11 nights on a cold rock shelf and the 3.5 years of legal proceedings and the particular weight of a 2-fingered gesture across a table that had started the whole thing. Nothing about it had been clean, she was glad. Clean things didn't hold. What held was the rough-hewn version, the thing built out of actual material by actual hands, with the flaws visible, proven sound by the weight it had already carried. Boone Ridge held. So did she. And on the first real warm morning of April, when the creek was running full and the east pasture was green and Henry was running in it with Daniel and Anna, while Clara called after them in the voice of a woman who has accepted that calling is primarily ceremonial at this point, Evelyn stood at the cabin door with her coffee and looked at all of it. The solid fence lines, the good horses, the people who had arrived here by various routes and stayed. And she was not happy in any simple sense. She was something more durable than happy. She was home, which was a thing she'd built herself, from materials she'd chosen, on ground that had been tried and had held. That was enough. That had always been going to be enough. If she could get here, she was here.